My name is Valisa Turner Howard, and I'm the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion and the Chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee at the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association. Thank you all for joining us for our Black History Month Real Talk, the Black Lawyers 2021 Call to Action. For some context, the REAL initiative started with the launch of a 21-day racial equity habit building challenge in late summer. We continued, or in the late summer of 2020. We continued with myriad real talks throughout 2020, including conversations around white allyship, the role of civil unrest in fomenting change, and others. This month, we also launched our real working groups. Those groups are dismantling systemic and negotiated racism, continuing criminal justice reform, promoting and growing white allyship, and interrupting the legal profession's systemic inequities. As a quick commercial, if you're interested in joining one of these working groups, please go to the CMBA website and sign up under the Real tab. Our panelists today for our conversation are Delonte Spencer Thomas, the first Vice President of the Norman S. Minor Bar Association, the premier Black Bar Association of Northeast Ohio, Devonna Mason, the President of the Cleveland Marshall Law BLSA Chapter, and Michaela Hayford, President of the Case Western Reserve University School of Law BLSA Chapter, and Stan Ball, who is, he has a new title, but he's in charge of litigation at Eaton. Today we're going to dive into the PBS documentary on the late US Congressman John Lewis. The film was the first biological documentary about John Lewis and his unyielding dedication to seeking justice for the marginalized and the ignored. The film spans more than half a century, tracing Lewis's journey of courage, confrontations, and hard-won triumphs. Through never-before-seen interviews shot over 20 years, Lewis describes his role in history-making civil rights events. Other key interviewees included civil rights activists Andrew Young, C.T. Vivian, Juanita Abernathy, and Bernard Lafayette, plus some of Lewis's congressional colleagues, Eleanor Holmes Norton, Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, Emanuel Kleber, and Amory Houghton. Once an activist pushing from the outside, Lewis became a determined legislator making noise on the inside. Lewis never let anyone else dictate when and how he should make noise. He always did what he thought was right, despite the consequences. He kept his eye on the prize. When his parents told him, "Don't get into trouble, don't get in the way," when others said, "It's the order of the day, most people have accepted segregation, don't rock the boat," when his mother told him to be particular as he went off to college, when others said, "It's just the way it is," Lewis said no, and he got into good trouble, necessary trouble, because as he said, he could no longer be satisfied to go along with an evil system. Lewis truly believed that we must all find a way to get in the way and make our country a better place. And today, we'll also discuss the importance and value of getting in the way and the Black lawyer's responsibility to get into good trouble. So I'm going to start off with my first question, and each of you can answer this. And when you do, if you'd like to give some more information about your background, you're welcome to do that. But I really want to get into our questions. The first one is, what did you learn about Congressman Lewis that you did not know prior to watching the documentary? Anybody can answer. Okay, Stan.
I was going to say, I know pretty much everybody on this panel, and none of y'all are that quiet. So first and foremost, thank you to the CMBA for the opportunity to be here with you all. And it's truly a blessing to be with such great aspiring attorneys and attorneys to talk about this issue. I'll give you two quick things on kind of my reflections early on about John Lewis and some things I didn't know. Number one, I didn't realize that there was a reconciliation that he had with the Klansmen who assaulted him. That's a level of compassion and niceness that I do not have and don't possess. So it was really just impressive to see that. But on a more serious note, I think one of the things that really stuck out to me was the tension between SNCC and King's kind of administrative team on the March on Washington. and the delivery of the speech that John Lewis was preparing. And I think that said something that's important for all of us to think about. It's a testament to what leadership really means. Leadership is not about your tenure, it's not about your title, it's about what your passion is, it's about your ability to articulate a vision and then to bet on yourself. And I think that that was a really critical moment, something I didn't really know that happened, that kind of behind the scenes tension between the old guard and the new guard. But I'm glad that the documentary brought it out a little bit more to light. And I'll pass it to Devonna since she was acting shy at the beginning of the call.
Stan, thank you. Hi, everybody. I want to express my gratitude as well. Thank you for this opportunity and giving us this platform. I think for me, a number of things I 100% agree with Stan that did surprise me, but it also resonates with the things we see today. It's always it's a difference in approach and how we address issues of racial injustice and inequity. And so to see back then the issues between Dr. King's movement and SNCC, and then today the challenge between, are you an activist on social media? Are you an activist? Were you at the rallies and things of that nature? And the challenge and the push that we put one another through and how we choose to step up, speak out, et cetera. And so that was interesting for me. And I think another thing in total is not a specific thing, but I think, John Lewis's life and character has always been this thing we know about, this thing I knew about. But I think to see him be characterized as a person in this documentary, as a man, and then also his story was interesting for me, even talking about the family dynamic. I think I could always guess that one's mother is going to be concerned about her child being arrested a number of times and being beaten and things like that. But I didn't know that he didn't initially have his family support. His family was telling him to chill out, to relax, to be in the background a little bit. And I think even when I first heard the statement from his mom when he went to college was to be particular, my immediate thought was be particular, you live a quality life, don't accept less than quality, et cetera, et cetera. And then it was like, no, that's not the message she was sending at all. And so how he was able to obviously still receive that, because we all respect our parents, but still go on to make this great name for himself and even inspire all of us to be here having this conversation today. And I will pass it to Delonte, because that's what we're doing.
Right.
Thank you. Also, thank you to the CMBA and the Diversity Inclusion Committee for putting this on. I'll agree with Stan that one of the things that I noted that I didn't know was the tension with SNCC and how he wasn't backed in some of the early marches in Selma, in the March on Washington speech. But to Devonna's point, it really goes to it really goes to being able to stand alone if need be, right? And how important and crucial that is, right? I can think of many different people, whether it's whether I know professionally or personally, that right now would probably also, discourage or encourage, certain activity. And so, being true to yourself and what you believe in was really important. The other thing that I noted that I thought was interesting that I didn't really realize was that John Lewis missed his graduation from being in jail. That was one thing I didn't quite realize. And I think what resonated to me was the youth in it all, right? Thinking about how young he was. Like, I knew that he was pretty young when he started, but that put it into real perspective for me that, wait a minute, you missed your college graduation because you were in jail fighting for for civil rights, for racial injustice, right? I'm thinking about where I was in college and what I was doing, and it certainly wasn't that, right? It was the next party I was going to, or and so it really put into context how important, and I think that's something we're going to talk about a little bit more in terms of the importance of youth in this fight. But yeah, Michaela, last but not least.
Sure, and thank you for having me, and thank you also to Stan for getting us started here. So to kind of jump on this leadership aspect, of course, like as a student, we were always told about the Pettus Bridge and what happened there, but watching it in this documentary, I did not realize kind of the way that John Lewis was, one, in the front, you know, just leading the masses, and two, that when they approached the officers and kind of that line, there wasn't a chance to confer with your colleagues about what your next move was going to be. And, you know, John Lewis was kind of, you know, everyone's looking to him, what's he going to do? And just the way in the documentary where he unflinchingly just, you know, continues to advance, I really had to take a step back and think about, you know, the type of leader and the type of strength it takes to, you know, face that. And so that is something that I didn't necessarily know about before I watched the documentary.
I dropped a tear during that moment, right? I'm like watching, I'm like, what's about to happen? What's about to happen? Right. And then just imagine, I mean, the fact that it even had this footage, you know, of it, watching it, right. And thinking about and hearing some of the commentary about like kind of what's going through their minds at the time. I'm just like, man, like it was a lot of emotion behind it for sure.
Yeah, I cried probably about 5 times in this 45-minute documentary because it was just so emotional. And thinking about, as several of you have said, where was I at 20 years old? You know, could I have been in this position? You know, could I have been there doing this work? And it was a very emotional documentary. So my next question is sort of dives into your life a little bit, and I would say all of you are good troublemakers in some way or shape or form. I've gotten to speak to or talk to all of you in some way, and so that tells me that you've probably been influenced by other good troublemakers, other folks who get in the way. So tell us about someone in your life who was a good troublemaker, and how did that impact your life?
I can start.
There you go.
So I think the first troublemaker I encountered would have to be my grandmother. And I mean, she would always speak on things that she found wrong. And she also, you know, kind of taught me the power of a strongly worded letter. I remember as a kid, there were these commercials for V8, like the juice. And so my grandmother hated violence of all kind, and she would always speak out on it. But there were these commercials for V8 where like the kids would slap their mom or something in the face and be like, oh, you could have had a V8. And it's a funny commercial, but my grandmother, she just hated it. And so she actually wrote to the company and told them about like, it's really important, like violence, this and that. And, you know, I'm sure they probably didn't even read the letter, but at the same time, it was like, the lesson that I got from it was just, if you feel so strongly about something, like you need to act on it. It's not enough to just sit around with your family and friends and kind of, you know, discuss it, but if you're willing to take that type of action. But then growing up and then kind of navigating college and now law school, I draw a lot of strength from my peers who are willing to get in the way and who are, you know, I just see them taking amazing strides and speaking truth and just wanting to be advocates. And for me, I think that's probably the greatest source of my inspiration, because if they're doing all of this work and we're peers, then it's like, well, why can't I? And I definitely should be doing that as well.
Thank you, Michaela. Devontae?
Yeah, I'll jump in. So, I mean, I had quite a number of good troublemakers in my life, probably starting with my mother being queen troublemaker, and not all good trouble. But you know, so it definitely started at a very early age. And I also had some really strong educators and quote unquote good troublemakers in the East Cleveland City School District that really instilled in me, you know, the power in challenge, right? And challenging your surroundings. And that was just kind of my thing, right? Like you know, I was always a why person, right? It was never, this is what it is, and you go with it all. It was always why. You know, how you get the superlatives. I don't even know if they still do the superlatives in high school, right? The best this or the most that. You know, I got like the Philosopher's Whisper award, which was like dedicated to the person who just always had something extra to say, who always challenged norms and attempted to stretch them. But I do want to highlight, you know, one particular person that I think really embodied this for me when I got to law school, which was a completely different environment and new construct for me. And that was Professor Brownie Lewis, who's now the dean of North Carolina Central School of Law. And, you know, she was one of the first people that I met in this space, in the legal community, that was just fearless. You know, is, you know, is fearless and is not afraid to speak up, is not afraid to be, you know, to reprimand it, you know, and consistently encourage students, you know, to break out of normal traditions. And so, you know, that was one piece that, you know, and it wasn't through just words, right? It wasn't through like, oh, you can do it, or, hey, you know, fight the good fight. It was through her actual actions, you know, seeing how she navigated just different spaces in her career really encouraged me to stay true to myself and know that, okay, I don't have to change because now I'm in this legal community, right? Now I'm supposed to act like this because I'm a law student, because I'm a lawyer. That no, I can very much still be myself and find, and if the space isn't there, then create it. And so that was one of the things that I really, really learned from her. And the last piece is, you know, learning how to not get bullied. You know, in this space was one of the things I really learned from Professor Lewis. Even if that means you have to seem like the bully, you know, and it's something that really sticks with me.
Giovanna?
So I have my good troublemaker in my life is my mother as well. So I think it's interesting that we're all sharing these maternal figures in our life, being the inspiration for giving us our voice and how we're using that voice in this legal field. And my mom is definitely that person. I don't just have DG's face, I have her voice. The women in my family have always been outspoken, and when it's wrong, it's wrong. When it's right, it's right. And when we're wrong, it's always hard to hold yourself accountable, but it's important to be able to do that too. And I think the good troublemaker in my life is definitely my mother, and she's within earshot of this. So I'm sure after she's going to be like, oh, taking credit, I did this, I might as well be in law school. But I think that's really important to note that that's where this comes from. And I find myself even being like, you know, this is just where I come from. I'm outspoken, I am directing my messaging, and it may not always be comfortable, but it's important to say. And resonating back to the documentary, it creates a fire and passion within you where you can't just sit by and let the wrong sit. That's the value that my mother has given me as a good troublemaker. If it is wrong, don't you dare sit there and be quiet about it. How dare you waste the gift God gave you in your voice, in your presence, in your ability to have an impact. And that is where this has all come from, this full circle story here. And I think that is definitely the reason I'm even in law school now. I knew as a 7th grader I was going to be in law school, but it was a long route to get here. But always has been important to me to advocate for others in a way that they not necessarily can't do for themselves, but it's empowering the voice of other people. I don't want to speak up for you. I want to speak up with you, giving people the voice that they need and to express what it is their needs are and to cause other people to listen. And so I think that my good troublemaker in my life is definitely my mom. She all the way through got it from her.
Stan? And
it's almost like a hostage situation. She's that close to you. She had to come and bother you if you didn't say her name. But you know, the two people that I go and get consistently, their advice and counselor are Marky Robinson and Charlie Price. If you've ever met Marky, I don't have to explain anything else after that. She's a truth teller. She's the person to say, is that enough? Are you pushing more? There's more that can be said, there's more that can be done. This doesn't move me. You need to be a little stronger here. Marky is the perfect person. But the other person I mentioned earlier, Charlie Price, I think it's important to highlight allies. Charlie's a white man. He's practiced for more than 20 years. He doesn't have to care about this stuff. And he runs our asbestos docket here at Eaton. And one of the things that he's always thinking about is, how can we be more inclusive? How can I push the envelope? How can I get people who traditionally don't have experience in this area, how can I get them engaged? And it's not like, oh, let me just write a letter and ask people to get diverse counsel. It's no, let me go find diverse counsel and hire them directly. And if there's associate talent, let me work with those associates to help them build the skills so that they can run cases, that they can be the future trial lawyers. And he's constantly pushing these issues, and he doesn't have to. Nobody's bothering him, but he takes it upon himself to be aggressive in the space, to really live out his values. And so I really admire Markey just of who she is. And then I admire Charlie because, similar to Delonte and asking the why, he's asking the why not. Why can't we make a dent in this space?
And I want to lift up you mentioning allies, because I think, as was shown in the documentary, that John Lewis did not just rely on Black people to make noise, especially when he got into Congress. He had to rely on and influence allies like Nancy Pelosi, like Harry Reid, to also carry that message. And he, over the years, he got very good at that as well. Towards the end, they showed where he led a sit-in on the House floor, and it wasn't all Black people; it was mostly white folks who were sitting on the floor with him. So I just want to highlight allies there. So I know many of you were involved, especially over the last year or so, in some voting rights stuff, some racial justice happenings in Northeast Ohio and nationally. But did this documentary expand your perspective on racial justice and democracy in the United States? If so, in what way? And anybody can answer. We don't have to do round robin again.
I'll come out the gate. No, no, it didn't. It was just another kind of sad reminder of America's failings to address this issue. As you saw, the violence that was brought about by just simple things like, oh, I'd like to exercise my constitutional right to vote. Oh, I think housing discrimination is bad. Oh, can I have some basic dignity in terms of riding the bus or eating somewhere? Unfortunately, we're still fighting these voting battles today. We're still dealing with violence for just basic things, basic our humanity to be recognized. And so the reality is at least from my perspective, is that this is not a hearts and minds conversation. It never has been a hearts and minds conversation. It's a money and power conversation. And so the notion that Black Americans should just continue on this slow, gradual, keep asking type of pace and be grateful for every little thing that we get this is stuff that happened decades ago, and we're seeing the exact same thing happen today. And so it's just, to me, it's not new. For those who look at this and say, I had no idea, I kind of scratch my head and say, how could you not have any idea? Because the same way that we're seeing officers murder unarmed Black men and women in the street today, we saw that in Black and white decades ago. So I don't know if anybody else has another perspective, but it wasn't new.
No, I agree. And to your point, right? I mean, it's a money and power thing, right? It is, racism is the child that runs parallel to classism, right? And so there are, this was a reminder to me. And I remember thinking this throughout the documentary. It's just a reminder that, this calls for much greater action than little tweaks here, right? Than reform here. That a lot of this is, a lot of what's needed is a complete dismantling and restructuring, right? So not so much, hey, let's get this little law passed or let's get that, because we have to remember and realize that we live in a racist society, right? And every single aspect of our society is rooted in white supremacy, right? So regardless of where people's minds and hearts are now today, we still live in a system that's designed to move and to perform a certain way. And it's still working exactly how it was intended to work.
Any other comments on that?
Sure. One kind of reflection that I had was just thinking about the January 6th insurrection and how all of that manifested. And, unfortunately, John Lewis had passed by that time, but part of me was almost grateful that he didn't have to see that. And I think, like, every time that we fail in terms of racial justice, it's almost like a slap in the face to people like John Lewis and those who came before him that have worked so hard to get us where we are now, and this country repeatedly, even in 2021. A lot of the times we see these patterns happening over and over again. I think the January 6th insurrection really was a huge manifestation of just the shortcomings of where we are now.
I second everything everyone has said already, so I'll let us move to the next question.
Alrighty. So we talked about the documentary. We talked about, our perspectives, whether they changed or not, or were expanded. What's a lesson that was learned from the documentary that still applies today? And I think Stan kind of started talking about this already. And how can Black lawyers capitalize on that lesson to make our country a better place? Where do we fit as Black lawyers in getting in the way, making good trouble? What's a lesson, and where do Black lawyers fit in to bring that lesson to fruition?
I'd like to start us off with that. So I think the immediate lesson that I took from it is to never compromise our integrity, never compromise our passion or our voice. And I think that in the documentary, you see when John Lewis first started his political career, and he was up against a friend of his, and there was the drug testing issue, and he called that man out on TV, and I cannot think of his name right now, but we all saw it. So looking back at that, his own reflection, he said himself, if I could go back and do it again, I wouldn't. And so a little bit of the last question and going into this one is that's kind of how our democracy is set up. If you are a politician, you are automatically untrustworthy. You are automatically pitted against the person that you are perceived as untrustworthy, and you are automatically pitted against the person that's next to you. And that for John Lewis to articulate himself that in pursuing his goals, he didn't need to undercut a friend, a peer of his own. And I think that that's an important lesson for us to think about what stance we all have as future attorneys, as current attorneys. Our job in this is to never compromise. We see what's happening in our firms, in our offices, in our work, whatever it is that we're doing, where we volunteer from where we volunteer to where we collect our checks, where we put our energy. It's important for us to maintain our integrity, and that integrity can't just be committed to a dollar sign and can't just be committed to, well, I have my job, let me protect my place. I think what I respect about John Lewis, he never tried to protect his place of where he was, and it earned him all the seats he could ever ask for, and some he didn't ask for. And so I think that that's important for all of us to think about, because oftentimes attorneys we're automatically placed in a high regard. We're seen as uber intelligent individuals who have the answers all the time, which is not true. We don't all have the answers all the time. We have to rely on one another just like anyone else. But I think when it comes to making significant and meaningful change, we as lawyers, because we automatically have this respect of our peers, of the public, of our families even, we have to not compromise. We have to be honest about what's happening in front of us. We have to be willing to call out what's okay and what's not okay and what we want to happen, and then be willing to work toward it, work for it, and work with someone else to achieve it. I think that that's the greatest lesson I could take from John Lewis's life, is that even when he wasn't proud of his own history, he continued to pursue his goals. He continued to work to be effective. He continued to work toward change without question, without influence of other people, his voice is what drove him, his belief, his passion, the discomfort he felt in injustices. And I think that that is our role and our duty. And it's not just a racial divide or racial issue. It is all of the above. The legal field has a history, of being exclusionary. How are we aiding in dismantling that? How do we talk to our clients? How do we tell people what it is that we do? Are we talking with an air of superiority? It can be as simple as the conversations we have every single day to the conversations we have with our bosses, the platforms that we use them responsibly, and we don't compromise our voices.
Who would like to go after that? And by
Not
the
me.
way, Ravana is only a law student, but did you hear that?
I mean, no, Devonna is absolutely spot on. You know, one of the lessons that I took, and I heard this in the documentary, and it was be a headlight and not a tail light. And I made a point to write that down because, you know, as lawyers, we have the access and the ability to be in the forefront. And so, you know, one thing that I'll mention, and because, you know, slavery is kind of on my mind right now. I just gave a talk on Monday on parallels between sports and slavery. And so, you know, one of the things that kind of goes along with slave mentality is the notion or the concept that the powers that be are going to give a certain number of us, right, access and privilege and you know, just enough that will keep us in line, right? Especially those of us who might be a little bit more educated or a little bit more adept to challenge things, right? To challenge the status quo. Well, let's get them a little bit in our system, right? So they won't make too much noise. And so, and I find that to be so, you know, analogous to kind of our profession, right? Because for us, that's us, right? We have a little bit more access than the average person. We have a little bit more education than the quote unquote average person. So we have access, we have privileges that most of our communities don't have. And so the lesson to me is that we have to use that twofold, right? Not to, so as Devonna mentioned, not to be complacent, but to, one, educate our communities, right? Don't get away from our home communities, because it's so easy to do, right? You pair us with our, you know, our salaries and access and all the different spaces that we're now in, and it's easy to forget the communities that all of us ultimately come from, one way, shape, or form. Right. And so it's crucial to make sure that we're using that to educate our communities on where we are, how they can get there, or what they can do at their level. Right. Because there's fight to go around. Right. It's not just up to us. It's not just up to any particular group. But so I mentioned twofold because, again, one is to educate our communities, but the other is to push our communities' agendas in the space that we have access to, right? There are so many things that our community needs that we might be in rooms to be able to push that or influence that, and we don't, because I don't want to lose my job, right? I don't want to lose my 6-figure salary. Like, I got a career to worry about. I got a family to think of, right? And if you watch the documentary, you know, it was rooted in courage. It was rooted in courage to be able to speak out, never mind the consequences. You know what I mean? Now, granted, that's not going to be everybody's fight, right? And so some of this comes with learning who's in the community, right? Learning who are the people who's ready to risk it all, right? Versus who are the people who are going to fight behind the scenes, right? We all have a different role to play. And it's important that we get to know each other and know who those people are, right? So not necessarily assuming that one of us, you know, or all of us need to play a certain role.
I like how you put that, because some people will be on the streets, and some people need to write a check to get you out of jail when you do get arrested. So I like how you put that. I think, and you also raise a great point, is that the further we get entrenched in our careers, the more timid we get, which is odd considering the higher up you go, the more power you accumulate. It's an odd dynamic that occurs. And so one of the things I just want to kind of pause just for a second here, and Delonte, he mentioned it earlier in his opening remarks, is to appreciate just how young these folks were, just how young they were. And what I liked about the documentary is that John Lewis, he took you to the rural parts of Alabama where he grew up. And think of, you put yourself in his mindset of, this is where I grew up, this segregation, racism is all I know. But with my little small amount of power that I can exercise to participate in a sit-in, to organize a freedom ride, to march, my little corner of power, okay, I'll exercise it, I'll use it. And I'll find some other people and we'll take their little parts of power and we'll exercise it together. And it grows and grows and grows. And much to Delonte's point about connecting with each other, that's something that we all have to do. And we have to do more of. And it's not just about, getting up together on a happy hour or having a beer. That's baby food. The level of connection that we need to have must be to understand each other's expertise, each other's passions, where we want to go, and how we can help each other, and have a truly candid conversation about, what can I do to help Delonte? What can I do to help Devonna? What type of connections can I pull upon to help each of you? Those are the types of conversations that we need to have. The other conversation that we all need to have and really be thinking about is appreciating the diversity within our own race. And let me be very clear on what I'm talking about. I'm talking about appreciating the gender differences, the LGBTQ community within our race. I'm talking about veterans. I'm talking about people who have disabilities, mental and physical. We have to get away from this notion of expecting that people, especially people of color, that just because they are a woman, that the entire women's movement will support them. Because what history has shown us is that Black women can lead, be on the forefront of women's movement, but when it comes times for rights to be delivered, guess who has to go to the back? Black women. What we've also seen from Black members of the LGBTQ community is that they can be on the front lines of fighting and lobbying for issues. But when you go to major metropolitan areas, you see that there is segregation within the LGBTQ community. And so we have people that look like us who are operating in islands of their own because we haven't done enough to not tolerate, but to celebrate their existence and bring them into the fold. We have to do better within ourselves to appreciate the differences within our own race. Last thing I'll say on this point is that in terms of action, what does that look like within the legal community? We have a responsibility, as Delonte said, and I said it before, is to connect with each other. We have an obligation to speak up in rooms where there's an opportunity to make things more inclusive. When we have the ability to exercise our power, whether it be to make direct hiring decisions or participate in groups that are making hiring decisions, to ask the question, are we being as inclusive? Do we have the right mindset as we're going out and hiring? Are we eliminating as much bias as possible during the hiring process? We have the obligation to mentor each other. And mentoring, it doesn't have to just be from, hey, I'm a practicing attorney, I'm going back to law school. I'm 35 years old, I need 15 mentors. So, from all different levels, we need to be talking to each other and sharing resources. And not just ideas, but when it comes to economic empowerment, I'll say it again for the people in the back, when it comes to economic empowerment, the same enthusiasm that we have about having conversations with GCs and chasing down business and getting jobs, we also need to have the same level of enthusiasm as it pertains to educating ourselves on economics and partnering with each other when there's an opportunity to advance ourselves through investments in the real estate and in other vehicles. We have to do a better job of that. These are things that we can all do on our own.
Thank you, Stan. Michaela?
Yeah, I'll hop on here. And I think, what Stan and Delonte were kind of discussing is strategy, and we saw that in the documentary, even just like the strategy and planning and investment behind getting ready for those lunch counter protests. It wasn't just let's go out to lunch and see what happens, but literally you see them practicing and preparing for what those circumstances are going to be. And I think, with all of us being, becoming attorneys or being attorneys, when we talk about the importance of race or racial equity in the workplace, a lot of times it seems like these conversations, we're not investing in the same amount of research and diligence and planning the way we do about all other legal issues that we work on, and instead it's meetings to talk about race where it's just like, I don't know, Bill, like, what do you think? Like, what off the top of your head? But no intention, no real research and understanding that people have worked on these issues for decades behind us. And so how are we advancing that and being strategic? And the other thing I wanted to talk about from the documentary, a lesson that I kind of pulled out of it was throughout the documentary, we're watching John Lewis watching footage of himself, and he's literally standing behind his previous acts of what he did throughout his career. And so for me, as a law student who's about to be starting my career, I kind of want to have that in the back of my mind, that am I 20, 30, 40 years down the line, am I going to be able to stand by this action or the way that I approached this? And so that was just a powerful thing to watch him as he, reflected on his career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Devontae.
If I can add one additional point that I want to make sure to reiterate, right? And that is, so often we think and feel that we don't have the power that we actually do have, right? Especially those of us who are younger and feel like, oh, I'm just starting, or, oh, I don't really have much of a voice, or, oh, I have all these different things to think about. Okay. It's so crucial to remember and to recognize that we absolutely have power, each and every single one of us, right? That society as we know it does not work without us. It literally does not work without our creativity. It doesn't work without our money. It doesn't work without our courage. Mm-hmm. That's so important to remember as we're navigating these spaces where we think we don't have a voice, because it does not work without us.
That's right. And that was one point that was brought up in the documentary, when Rosa Parks would not give up her seat, and then the bus boycott started. And I think it was called the bus boycott, but one of the speakers in the film said it wasn't a boycott. It was, we removed ourselves from, as Stan said, this economic, this piece of the economy. We literally just removed ourselves from that conversation. And that made a huge impact, huge.
Was it $3,000 a day?
Yeah, and at the time, that was a lot of money. And it was for a year, 300 and some odd days? Mm-hmm. That no one no Black people rode the bus. Right. And so that gets to your point of collective action definitely makes a difference. So this question is one of the reasons why I wanted Stan to be on here. He is a corporate lawyer through and through. So he's in charge of litigation. He's worked at a firm. He's now at Eaton. And I feel that sometimes Black lawyers or lawyers in general who are not public interest or civil rights lawyers, they sort of are like, well, that's not really my thing. I'll write, as Stan said, I'll write a check, but that's not, it's not really what I do. Is getting in the way and getting into good trouble solely the purview of the public interest or civil rights lawyer? What is, or is there an obligation, a responsibility for all Black lawyers, including corporate, law firm, non-traditional, everyone, if you have a law license, you went to law school, you don't, if you have the knowledge and the information, the skills that we gain, is it also your obligation and your responsibility to get in the way and to get in good and necessary trouble?
Yeah, I'm gonna, here's my corporate side coming out. I'm gonna play with these words a little bit. I don't think it's an obligation to get in the way. I think that it's an obligation or it's a requirement to make a way. And what I mean by that is, I think when you say get in the way, get in the way means to obstruct, to slow something down. But to make a way means to move things, to exercise your influence and power to move things out the way and create a sustainable pipeline, a sustainable pathway for others to come behind you. That is the purview of the corporate lawyer, the individual who can adjust and disrupt the status quo of an industry. That's what your responsibility as a corporate lawyer. And so what does that look like in practical terms? As I mentioned before, if you have the authority to make hiring decisions, both within your firm or make hiring decisions with the engagement of your outside counsel, you need to do it. Hiding behind D&I statements that your corporations or your law firms make, or the fact that they put up Black Lives Matter for 3 months on their corporate website doesn't mean anything. What are you doing? What is your legacy? How are you participating in this? And so I think that it matters on your subject matter level of expertise, who I'm hiring to do my work, but also using the corporate apparatus to make an impact in America. And if you know me closely, one of the biggest things that I'm passionate about here at Eaton is our participation with the Business Roundtable, which is a consortium of some of America's largest employers. And I'm very proud of the fact that our CEO chairs the Equitable Justice Subcommittee. And through that subcommittee, we have pushed and championed police reform at the national level, as well as challenging the stigma that surrounds second chance hiring. And in the next couple of months here, I think that what we're going to launch and what we're going to make public, America's going to be very proud of the work that we're doing, using our influence through the corporate apparatus to make a difference and make a difference, a meaningful difference in our criminal justice system. And so the last thing I'll just say on this point is, whether you are a part of a corporation that has a global footprint, whether you're a part of a law firm that is operating nationally or has some status in the community, you have an obligation. You really do. You have an obligation because of all the people that came before you that made a way for you to continue to forge that pathway, to continue to stand up and maintain the pipelines that have been developed and create new ones.
Thank you, Stan. Does someone else want to talk about that?
So I can jump in here too. One of the things that I thought about with this question was that, I can't help but to feel like, this is a responsibility for all of us, right? So not just those who practice civil rights work or who do public interest work. And I think there's an argument that if this was something that we all took responsibility for, we may have less need for people to do specific civil rights work, right? If we address this in labor and employment, if we address this in housing, if we address this in real estate, if we address this, in business and in corporate matters, if we address this in tax and environment, et cetera, right? There may be a little bit less need for a specialized space, less, not none. But so I can't help but to feel like this is a responsibility for all of us to push the envelope. I think for allies that may be with us, right? There's a responsibility there, to use your privilege. It's a question that I get asked often, in doing these types of presentations or just elsewhere when I'm having these types of conversations, right? Is what can I do? And the answer is pretty much this, is standard for me anyway, is use your privilege in the space that you can use it in, right? So it's one thing to come and join us on these conversations and say, oh yes, this is wrong. And oh yes, I support you. And oh yes, we need change. But are you using your voice at the country club? Are you using your voice on the golf course? Are you using your voice at the dinners with your friends and your colleagues that can also be a change agent in this fight? You know, are you using your money? Are you using your, you know, your bodies if necessary? You know, and Kayla Griffin mentioned this, and it's resonated with my mind ever since she said it. But you know, using your body if you have to support, protect, and defend Black people. You know what I mean? And particularly in this space. So it's not enough to, as Stan mentioned, to have a D&I statement, right? But what are you actually doing behind it? One of the things that I'm having a front row seat right now, working in career services at Case, and we all know it, right? And going through law school, you know how the recruitment process works and all those types of things, right? And it's something you just like, okay, this is kind of how it is. You know, now being on the other side of it, I'm often reminded of just how disproportionate, you know, the whole operation really is, you know, in terms of how we look at or value Black people in this profession. And so that again makes it a responsibility of all our allies as well. Because going to the collective point that we just kind of talked about, what happens if we decide, you know what, we don't want to work in your law firms anymore? What happens? Right? The whole structure completely changes then. What happens when we say we don't want to work in your corporations, right? Or particularly as more clientele are requiring or demanding, you know, diversity, you know, learning how to, or not even just learning, but doing, you know, using our voices to really push the envelope. So it's a responsibility for all of us, not just any one particular group of lawyers to push the envelope here.
Yeah, I'll hop on there. I think, you know, as Black people in America, though, we should be, at least for me and as someone looking at corporate law, I think we should remain uncomfortable with the idea of it. I mean, just based on the history of the exploitation that has happened here. And so I think there's a way to be in these systems and be uncomfortable and also be on the lookout. And in terms of like getting in the way, sometimes that might just be taking up space and holding roles, decision-making roles that were previously, you know, abused by people and weaponized against Black people. But you know, I'm uncomfortable with the way that corporations have functioned in the United States, and I think we have to be honest with ourselves about that too, and even just take stock of what exactly are we doing as corporate attorneys, or what exactly are these companies doing? And if it's not okay, then it doesn't matter who's doing the work, whether it's young Black lawyers or whatever. If we're exploiting our own community, then that's a problem, and we've got to start working on that and taking accountability for it.
I think what everyone said so far, I second all of the above. I think an important theme that's important for us to remember to walk away with is how we approach these issues. It doesn't matter how we approach it as long as we're approaching it. And I do believe that that is everyone's obligation to be able to do that. I think that if it is writing the check, write the check. If it is using your body, use your body. If it is using your voice, use your voice. But to echo Delonte, and I've said this in other panels that I've done, this conversation about equity and inclusion and really bucking against injustices isn't committee work for us to say for our cute little committee that happens on noon every third Thursday of the month, for our random club group that's a book club after school on the second Tuesday of the year, like whatever that is. Yes, do that. Engage how you need to. Read the books, have the conversations, read the blogs, write the blogs. However, take this home with you. Like Delonte said, if this were present in other areas, these kinds of conversations not necessarily lessen the need, but lessen how frequently we have to repeat ourselves. This isn't the first conversation we are having on these topics and talking about what we want to see from ourselves, from our peers, from future attorneys, from current attorneys, et cetera. And so I think it's important. These are the conversations you take home with you, and seeing putting yourself in the position of another person is a very difficult thing to do. However, when we are in these spaces and these spaces of privilege that we all occupy in our own lives, if we were not who we are, how would we perceive this message, this conversation, this context, et cetera? And thinking about that in the workplace, thinking about that in our offices. And so my background is in higher education. And so I was a college administrator for 8 or 9 years. And that helped me learn to think about my identity, obviously as a Black woman, but then the identities I don't have: ability, gender, language, socioeconomic status, etc. And so when we being future, current, all attorneys, Black lawyers, Black leaders, when we are in these spaces, and even our allies, especially our allies, when you're in these spaces, when you're in the boardroom, when you're in the meeting, you're having these conversations, and maybe you're discussing an issue or matter, and other people who are the topic of said issue aren't present. How would they perceive that conversation? Would you feel as included if you weren't a man in this conversation? Would you feel as included if you weren't a woman in this conversation? Would you feel as included if you weren't a Black person, et cetera? Like, taking these conversations home with you and your ability to understand that racism and discrimination and injustice has been so ingrained in us that we accept things as they are and then we question it later. It's okay to question it later, but come back to that conversation. I think it's important, and I'll stop beating the dead horse because, again, this is what everyone has said so far, but it's important to continue these conversations at home with your friends in the spaces in which others aren't in the room. Some people are going to be comfortable speaking in front of our allies in a way, saying things, asking questions that they're not going to be comfortable asking us. And that's okay, because there's some questions you cannot ask me. Don't put me on the spot like that. I'm be honest about that. But it's important to have those conversations with your colleagues.
So we're getting to time, and I want to get the one question that we did have was from Marissa Darden. And that question is, why do you think we don't have the kind of big national Black leaders like Lewis? And Lewis called A. Philip Randolph the Dean of Black Leadership in the movie. I don't know if you guys heard that. Why don't we have these people anymore? And how do we begin to cultivate the national Black leader like they had in the 50s and 60s? Do you think that model would work now? And thinking about that, also blend into your response any suggestions you have regarding what kind of good trouble Black lawyers can get into in 2021. What's the call to action? And if you want to share, what good trouble are you getting into this year? So that's a blended, this is your final statement. So what's your call to action? What do you think folks should be getting into in 2021? What is our, where we all should collectively be putting our resources? If you'd like to share what you're doing this year. And also respond to the question about, why don't we have that national Black leader anymore? And should we? Is that something we should try to cultivate again?
I'll go quick because I got to go to my next meeting. But on the national leader, I think we've got plenty. I think you've got between Stacey and DeRay, you've got your vice president. I think you have a good amount of leaders at that level. But I think there's a couple of things that are, one's a complication and one is a good thing. One complication is, I don't think you could ever stand up one singular figure to be this perfect person in the internet age. It's not possible. Like there's no way you could create another John Lewis. You wouldn't even get off the ground. And then that's a complication. But the benefit of that is, because of the advancements of technology and our ability to communicate effectively with each other, we don't need a singular person to be a leader. The things that some people I'm looking at on my screen, the things that you all can do and are doing both locally and at the state level are incredible. And generations before you could never dream of having that amount of impact. So I'm not sure that we need it. I don't think we could have it, but I also think we need to give some credit to the individuals who have emerged to do some great things like Stacy, like DeRay, like the Vice President, who are worth emulating.
Following Stan, I think, and I'm gonna take this from Spike Lee, but we are those leaders. We are Malcolm X, we are Martin Luther King, we are John Lewis, we are Kamala Harris, we are that. I agree with Stan 110%. I don't think we needed to be one person. Those singular individuals made it possible for us as the collective to be that presence, for us as the collective to be that voice. And as far as call to action, I think we've been saying it throughout this entire conversation, is standing up, speaking up, being visible in the way that you define that visibility, but being present in these issues and not just sitting on the sidelines and saying, well, it doesn't apply to me right now, or it doesn't, well, I didn't experience that, so it must not be real. I think it's important for us to, again, like I'll echo, step outside of ourselves. And as far as our organizations are concerned, what our BLSA chapter has done a lot of is like serving our community, but really pushing our institution to to better approach these conversations and make significant and meaningful changes around being a more inclusive institution, around being more inclusive, producing more inclusive lawyers. And so that has appeared in the racial justice task force groups that we have all been a part of. And if you don't know about them, feel free to contact me later. I'm on LinkedIn. But we are doing a number of things that cause us to think about how we approach academia in the legal field differently, how we approach community relationships differently. And I think that as long as anyone in any capacity, no matter the field, how you're using your law degree, wherever you occupy space, you can commit a portion of that space or all of that space to equity, inclusion, diversity, etc.
Thank you. Michaela, you got 1 minute or less.
Sure. Well, I kind of echo what has been said in terms of a singular movement leader. I think that model, like we're kind of past that model, and we really need to be looking kind of more inward in our communities too, and look at more grassroots approaches to the leaders that are around us. But I do want to talk about some of the good trouble that the Case Western BLSA chapter has been up to at our law school. We have just really been working with our administration and with our alumni and our community to build a community, because one of the biggest issues that we have is that there just aren't that many Black law students at our law school, and there also aren't enough faculty and administrators. And so that makes it really hard to have collective actions and to have a sense of community. So we've been working a lot on admissions and really advocating to keep the Black faculty that we do have and to expand them. And so that has been a combination of pushing on the administration to get these changes, and also collaborating and working with them. So that's been a lot of the great work that I'm really proud of from the Case Western BLSA chapter.
Thank you. Delonte, 1 minute or less.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what everyone has said about the state of leadership. And I love that we've grown from having to have, a particular set of leaders, right? That many of us can be in different places, especially in this tech age. Because and Brandon Brown made a comment in the chat that I want to point everybody's attention to see, because it's super important and impactful in terms of the state and of assassinations of our leaders, right? And I think how we have grown from that allow us to diversify, allows us to expand, allows us to be in more than one place. That limits our chance of being assassinated, right? That if we can be if we can be in multiple places at one time. One of the things that John Lewis mentioned in the documentary is that, jails can't hold us all, right? The jails can't hold us all. If we're all over the place, right? We can make a bigger impact. And so it's just a matter of just recognizing where those leaders are, right? Because they certainly exist. And so in terms of call to action, I would just say, I would say be particular, but not quite in the way that John Lewis' mother, meant it, but be particular about our demands. you know, one thing that I think we tend to wash down a little bit is what we actually want and need, right? We'll say we'll settle for, well, okay, we'll take this because we don't want to push the envelope as much, right? But be particular about our demands and what we need. One of the things that also came from the documentary is that John Lewis said that we don't want our freedom gradually, we want it now. Right. So it's not enough to just say, oh, give me this a little bit now. Right. Because then the response is going to be, well, we just gave you something. Right. And so being able and being comfortable or uncomfortable enough to demand it now. You know, some of the things that you know, that we have going on with the Norman S. Minor Bar Association, we certainly invite, you know, we invite participation on. You know, we have our next general body meeting on March 17th. And we encourage people to come and push us. You know what I mean? Like there's always a lot of criticism, right? From, you know, about what our organizations are doing and not doing. But again, I'm inviting you, I'm encouraging you to come and push us, right? If there are things that we feel like we should be doing, things that we shouldn't be doing, right? We want to hear that. We want to be able to come together and have those conversations. You know, we're working on something right now with Senator Sherrod Brown. If you're on our listserv, you've received information about that. In terms of addressing the lack of Black people on the bench and on the federal bench, and some of the appointments that are soon to be made, and making sure we have a space there. And there's a number of different initiatives that we're working on. And I know for the sake of time, I won't you know, belabor the point, but pay attention and be particular.
So I want to thank all of our panelists, all of our guests for coming in and tuning in today. And I'll leave us with these words because I know everybody has another meeting. Be a headlight, not a tail light. Make a way, as Stan said, and get into good trouble. Thank you so much for joining us.